The studio lights in Ouagadougou burned hotter than usual that night. Rows of chairs were filled, shoulder to shoulder, with citizens who had come not for entertainment, but for answers. On one side of a plain wooden desk sat a sharply dressed journalist, papers aligned with surgical precision, carrying the confident smile of a man who believed he was in control. On the other side sat Captain Ibrahim Traoré, steady in his uniform, hands clasped, eyes fixed, not aggressive, not evasive, simply present. If you have lived long enough in the United States to watch presidents rise and fall, policies promised then forgotten, and nightly news drown in rehearsed talking points, you may have asked yourself a simple question: does honest leadership still exist? Tonight, we look for that answer not in Washington, but in Burkina Faso, a place the headlines, especially Africa news, often summarize in a single phrase: a nation in crisis. But what if the most genuine political moment of this decade happened here, under these bright lights, before a continent holding its breath? Stay with me. If you believe truth should matter more than optics, this story of Ibrahim Traoré may challenge what you thought leadership could be. And if you value voices ignored by the mainstream, consider subscribing before we begin. The interview began like any other political program, polite, structured, predictable, but nothing about Burkina Faso was predictable anymore, and nothing about Ibrahim Traoré had ever been polite in the way traditional power expects. The country had come through years of corruption, insurgency, starvation, and the slow draining of its minerals into foreign hands. Many outside observers, especially those reading quick briefs from Africa news, saw only the headline: a young captain seized power. But inside the nation, the question was far more complex. Was this man a disruptor of order, or the first leader in decades who refused to look away from the suffering he grew up with? The studio that night felt less like a news program and more like a court of public reckoning. Every seat was taken. Some in the audience had walked miles to be there. Others wore the quiet anger of people who had lost sons and husbands to violence, and the journalist, precise, poised, calculating, seemed to understand he had been handed a rare opportunity. He didn't want dialogue. He wanted exposure. He wanted to corner this young captain on live television and ask the question critics whispered across Burkina Faso and beyond: who gave you the right to lead? For the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed on familiar terrain: security plans, economic reforms, anti-corruption measures. To the surprise of some viewers, Ibrahim Traoré answered each question without deflecting, without slogans, without the polished evasiveness Americans have grown used to hearing from politicians on Sunday morning shows. But then the tone shifted. The journalist leaned forward, shuffled his papers with exaggerated deliberation, and delivered the line he had clearly been preparing all evening. "How can anyone trust you?" he asked, voice sharpened for maximum impact. "When you took power by force, when you overthrew a government, when you broke the very laws you claimed to defend." A murmur rippled through the audience. This was not a question, it was an indictment, a trap, a televised attempt to reduce every hope and every wound of the nation to a single accusation. And in that moment, beneath lights hot enough to melt any mask, Ibrahim Traoré did something no one journalist, critic, or viewer expected. He smiled. A calm, steady smile that did not deny the question, did not fear it, and did not run from what was coming next. The smile from Ibrahim Traoré caught the journalist off guard. It wasn't smug. It wasn't defensive. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he's not afraid of the truth, even if the truth is heavy, complicated, and uncomfortable. The audience sensed the shift before the journalist did. They leaned in, waiting to see whether the young captain of Burkina Faso would dodge, attack, or unravel. Instead, he nodded slowly and said words that no media advisor in Washington or Paris would ever recommend. "That is a fair question, and I want to thank you for asking it." The journalist blinked. This was not the script. Leaders accused of coups usually deny, blame, or pivot, but Traoré did none of that. He accepted the accusation head-on, not as an attack, but as a responsibility he owed to the people watching: farmers in remote villages, teachers unpaid for months, soldiers fighting without boots, and mothers who had buried their sons. "You ask how the people can trust me," he continued quietly. "Trust is not something a leader demands. It is something he must prove." A hush fell over the studio. Then, without raising his voice, he cut to the heart of Burkina Faso's agony. When children are starving, where is the law? When mothers choose which child will eat tonight, where is the law? When our resources leave this land while our people die in poverty, where is the law you speak of? It was not rhetoric, it was indictment, and not against him, but against decades of elite leadership that lived far from the suffering they governed. Some audience members wiped tears, others clenched their fists, reliving memories of buried loved ones. Even the cameras seemed to hover closer, as if the room itself recognized that something rare was unfolding. The journalist tried regaining control. He flipped to the next page of his well-prepared dossier. "Let's speak honestly, Captain," he said. "You froze bank accounts. You expelled diplomats. Some say you are reckless. Some say you are isolating Burkina Faso. Some even call you dangerous." This time, murmurs filled the room, some agreeing, others bristling. Traoré didn't blink. "I froze the accounts of thieves," he said plainly. "Money stolen from teachers who received no salary, stolen from nurses working without medicine, stolen from farmers who cannot afford seeds. Should I have sent them polite letters asking them to return what they stole?" The journalist stiffened. This was supposed to provoke political defensiveness. Instead, it triggered moral clarity. Traoré described walking through villages where children's bellies were swollen from malnutrition, while trucks loaded with gold passed them by, headed for foreign corporations and foreign ports. "We were a nation rich in minerals and poor in dignity," he said. "If defending my people makes me reckless, then I accept the title." The room was split, some nodding fiercely, others uneasy. It was the kind of division Americans know well, the tension between those who want order and those who demand justice, two values rarely found in the same place at the same time. The journalist, feeling his grip slipping, reached for the sharpest blade in his stack. "Let's talk about your alliances," he said. "You work with countries that do not have clean human rights records, Russia, for example. How do you justify partnering with nations whose values do not reflect the ideals you claim to defend?" There it was, the chess move meant to corner him. If Traoré defended the alliances, he'd look hypocritical. If he distanced himself, he'd look weak, even unstable. A perfect trap, elegant and deadly. Traoré closed his eyes for a brief moment, as if searching for the truest words he had. When he opened them, something in the studio shifted. Even through the screen, viewers could feel it. "When your house is on fire," he said slowly, "you do not ask the man who brings water which church he attends, or what his politics are. You take the water, because your home is burning." The line sliced through the room. Even viewers watching later online would pause their screens at that moment. "Our house in Burkina Faso has been burning for decades," he continued. "And the hands that now criticize our choices, where were their clean hands while our people burned? Where were their perfect principles when our children were taken by hunger and by terror?" Some audience members broke down into tears. Others nodded in solemn recognition. "And let me be clear," he said, not defensively, but with conviction. "I will work with anyone who helps me protect my people, anyone who helps me feed them, anyone who helps me restore dignity to this land. And I will not apologize. Not to you. Not to anyone." The studio went still. The journalist's face paled. This wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reversal. The trap had collapsed, and the hunter now looked like the one exposed. In homes across West Africa, in cafes from Niamey to Bamako, on diaspora social feeds in Paris and Chicago, people watching felt the same thing. A man refusing to hide behind political theater. But the most astonishing moment of the night had not yet happened. It would come when Ibrahim Traoré stood up quietly, without anger, and walked away from the desk entirely. When Ibrahim Traoré rose from his chair, no one in the studio knew what to expect. Not the security team, who suddenly shifted their stance. Not the journalist, whose eyes widened in something between confusion and fear. Not even the audience, who collectively held their breath as he walked not toward the exit, not toward confrontation, but straight into their midst. He stopped beside an elderly woman in the third row, the same woman whose quiet tears had been caught earlier by a camera intended to capture discomfort, not heartbreak. And then, in front of the hot lights, the rolling cameras, the silent crowd, he did something leaders rarely do in Washington, Paris, or anywhere power hardens the human spirit. He knelt. "Mother," he said softly, "why are you crying?" Her voice trembled as she answered. Her son Musa had been killed 3 years earlier by terrorists. He had been 19. He wanted to be a teacher. The room fell silent, so quiet that even viewers at home could feel the weight. Traoré closed his eyes for a moment. "Musa," he repeated, as if anchoring the boy's name somewhere deep within himself. Then he promised her not for applause, not for cameras, but with the sincerity of a man carrying the burdens of an entire nation, that her son would never be forgotten. He kissed her forehead, stood up, and gently released her hands. It was a moment no headline from Africa News, no political analysis, and no diplomatic memo could fully capture. A leader choosing humanity over performance. And then something extraordinary happened. The studio, so tense moments earlier, rose to its feet. People cried openly. People applauded with the raw force of those who have waited too long to be seen, too long to be respected, too long to believe leadership could still be rooted in empathy. Even the journalist who had prepared to dismantle him sat frozen, stripped of his earlier confidence. But the story did not end inside that room. Within an hour of the broadcast ending, clips of the moment spread through group chats, community pages, and diaspora networks. Young men crowded around a single battered smartphone in a northern village, using shared data to watch the replay. They had once planned to leave Burkina Faso, cross into Libya, risk the Mediterranean, and chase survival more than opportunity. After watching the interview, one of them, Amadou, 23, stood and said something none of them expected from their own lips. "Maybe we should stay." For a country long defined by loss more than hope, the sentence landed like a spark in dry grass. In Ouagadougou's middle-class neighborhoods, where skepticism toward military leadership was almost a civic tradition, families watched the interview again and again. A university professor, known for publicly condemning the coup, phoned her sister to confess something she never imagined herself saying. "I did not want to believe him. I thought he was just another man in uniform. But did you see how he spoke to that woman? Maybe I was wrong." And in neighboring Niger, Mali, and Guinea, young people gathered in cafes and living rooms. They weren't watching a politician. They were watching someone who sounded like their brothers, their cousins, their friends, someone who carried the same anger and exhaustion they carried, the same hunger for dignity. Many had grown up seeing Africa portrayed as a crisis, as a battlefield, as a place always waiting for the approval of outside powers. But in the words and actions of Ibrahim Traoré, they saw something else, a leader who refused to apologize for defending his people. Meanwhile, the most unexpected ripple came from the woman whose grief had become the emotional center of the night, Musa's mother. In an interview days later, her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "I did not expect anything when I went there," she said. "But when Captain Traoré knelt and said my son's name, something inside me felt seen. Not healed, not yet, but seen." Like a stone dropped into a lake, her words created circles far beyond her. People across Burkina Faso began sharing their own stories using a new hashtag, #Musa. Mothers posted the names of children taken by hunger or violence. Fathers shared memories of sons lost to insurgency. Families who had never been acknowledged by their government suddenly found themselves part of a collective mourning, one that turned pain into visibility. Still, not all reactions were emotional. Some were practical. Within weeks, new schools opened. Clinics received medicine they had lacked for months. A national agricultural initiative expanded. Anti-corruption efforts intensified. High-ranking officials were arrested. Stolen funds were recovered. Budgets were audited publicly. Critics, however, remained vocal. They pointed out that security challenges persisted. The economy was still fragile. One leader, even one as determined as Ibrahim Traoré, could not rewrite decades of damage overnight, and in a rare radio address 2 months later, Traoré himself acknowledged these limits. "I am not a savior. I am a man trying his best. I will make mistakes. I have made mistakes. But I will never stop fighting. I will never forget where I come from or whom I serve." For many watching from abroad, especially those who relied on quick summaries from Africa News, the interview was simply viral. But for the people living the reality of Burkina Faso, it became something deeper, a mirror held up to the nation's wounds, and for the first time in a long time, a glimpse of healing. And outside Burkina Faso, the world was beginning to ask its own questions, questions about narrative, about leadership, about the meaning of dignity in a continent too often spoken about and rarely spoken with. It was no longer just a national moment. It had become a continental one. For decades, Africa has appeared on American screens in predictable ways, as a map of conflict zones, a chart of migration trends, a footnote in foreign policy briefings, or a headline framed by outlets like Africa News that rarely go beyond the surface. Few stories from the continent ever force Washington, Brussels, or New York to reconsider their assumptions. But the night Ibrahim Traoré walked off the stage and knelt before an old woman in Burkina Faso, something unusual happened. The world looked up, and it didn't quite know what to do with what it saw. In Paris and London, editors scrambled. The early coverage was predictable phrases like coup leader, strongman, unpredictable military figure, filled the first drafts. For years, this was the framework Western media used for the Sahel. Instability equals dangerous. Independence from Western partners equals suspicious. Any cooperation with Russia equals hostile. But the footage from Ouagadougou didn't fit the model. No media playbook anticipated a leader who accepted hostile questions without evasion, reframed legality through the lens of human suffering, refused to apologize for defending his people, and then knelt, unprompted, before a grieving citizen. The moment was too human to be dismissed, too emotional to be ignored, too public to be spun. Within hours, the world's major networks aired clips with commentary that betrayed their discomfort. Some anchors insisted viewers remain cautious about romanticizing Traoré. Others admitted quietly that they had rarely seen such authenticity in contemporary politics, certainly not in many Western capitals. In the comment sections and social feeds beneath these broadcasts, one question appeared again and again. If this happened in our own country, would we see it the same way? Inside the US Capitol, the interview triggered a different reaction, one marked by strategic anxiety. For years, Burkina Faso had been a dot on Pentagon maps, a hotspot of jihadist threats, a logistical challenge, a zone of influence contested by Russia, France, and the West. Reports for congressional committees rarely included the names of villagers or grieving mothers. They included numbers, attacks per month, estimated militant groups, mining concessions, troop deployments. But now millions of Americans had watched Ibrahim Traoré say, "When your house is on fire, you do not ask the man who brings water which church he attends." That single line created an unexpected pressure point. It forced policymakers to confront a question they preferred to avoid. If the US offered Burkina Faso only criticism, while others offered security, who exactly was abandoning whom? For older American viewers, veterans of Vietnam, of Iraq, of watching administrations rise and fall, the question felt painfully familiar. Many wrote online that they recognized the tone in Traoré's voice, the exhaustion of communities long ignored by distant power. Washington analysts, accustomed to tidy geopolitical categories, found themselves grappling with something they rarely factored into strategy: moral legitimacy. If Western institutions struggled, the African diaspora did not. From Atlanta to Paris to Toronto, people of West African descent posted reaction videos, essays, and live discussions. Many said they had grown up watching Western coverage of their homelands filtered through pity or suspicion. But this was different. Here was a leader speaking in a way that echoed their parents, their grandparents, their childhood villages. Here was a leader who did not ask for validation from global powers. A leader who articulated the fundamental pain of the continent. We are not poor. We have been plundered. In diaspora communities, the kneeling became a symbol, not of weakness but of honor, not of submission but of accountability. European capitals reacted with irritation beneath diplomatic language. France, in particular, viewed Traoré's rise and the rising self-confidence in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger as a challenge to decades of political and economic influence. Analysts there focused on one theme: if Sahel nations choose partners outside Europe, Europe loses leverage. But even European critics admitted something quietly. The interview had given the Sahel a voice the West could no longer frame on its behalf. In Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, the interview resonated in a different register. Commentators noted, a leader confronting foreign exploitation, a leader prioritizing survival over ideological alignment, a leader refusing to apologize for choosing what works over what pleases the West. In these regions, Traoré's interview was not controversial, it was recognizable. But the most powerful shift happened not abroad, but in living rooms across the United States. For older Americans, those who saw Watergate, Iran-Contra, the invasion of Iraq, and the slow decay of public trust, Traoré's interview stirred an uncomfortable introspection. When was the last time a leader of ours spoke with that level of raw honesty? When was the last time someone in power knelt to comfort a citizen without cameras orchestrating the moment? When did politics become so performative, so scripted, so hollow? In a country where many now feel emotionally abandoned by their own elected officials, watching a captain from Burkina Faso comfort a grieving mother created a sense of longing, perhaps even envy. It raised a final question that hung in the air long after the clip ended. If leadership rooted in humanity is still possible in Burkina Faso, why is it so rare in the nations that preach democracy to the world? And that question prepared the ground for the twist, the moment when Traoré's actions left the screen and entered history. The moment stunned everyone. The lights were still hot, the cameras still rolling, the journalist still gripping his papers, but Ibrahim Traoré no longer belonged to the stage. In the United States, when a politician feels cornered, they double down on talking points or storm out in indignation. But here, in the heart of Burkina Faso, a leader chose a path almost unknown in modern politics. He stepped away from the spotlight. He walked past the journalist, slow, deliberate, unthreatening. Even the security detail paused, unsure whether to intervene. Something was shifting in the room, and everyone felt it instinctively. Then came the moment that would define the night. He stopped in front of an elderly woman, knelt beside her, and held her trembling hands. No scriptwriter in Washington, or producer in New York, could have crafted what followed. "Mama," he said gently, "why are you crying?" Her voice quivered as she told him about her son Musa, killed by terrorists at 19, a boy who wanted to become a teacher. The grief in her words was not political. It was the kind of pain that governments rarely see, and even more rarely acknowledge. Traoré closed his eyes and repeated the boy's name, not as a talking point, not as a gesture for the cameras, but as a promise. When he kissed her forehead, a collective shudder moved through the room. Even those who doubted him felt something ancient and moral rise to the surface. The audience stood. They cried openly. For the first time in years, many believed they were not invisible. In that moment, Burkina Faso was no longer just a country in crisis described by outlets like Africa News. It was a place reclaiming dignity through a leader who refused to hide behind his title. And the night was far from over. The video spread with the speed of a continental heartbeat. Within 1 hour, every major chat group in Burkina Faso had clipped the scene of Traoré kneeling. Within 3 hours, it dominated feeds across West Africa. Within 6 hours, it crossed the Atlantic, landing on American timelines, usually saturated with cynicism. But virality is not legacy. The real test began after the applause faded. Inside Burkina Faso, reports rolled in. Schools receiving new funding for the first time in years. Clinics restocked with medicine. Agricultural programs expanded. Corrupt officials arrested, some shocked to find that their long-protected impunity was over. Stolen funds recovered and redirected publicly. At the same time, Traoré's critics remained loud and not without reason. Security threats persisted. The economy strained under years of damage. His reforms were ambitious but heavy, and one leader, even one as driven as Ibrahim Traoré, could not remake a nation overnight. Then came his radio address 2 months later, surprising both supporters and skeptics. "I am not a savior," he said. "I am a man trying his best. I will make mistakes. I already have. But I will not stop fighting for the people who trusted me with their hopes." For many Americans watching from afar, this was the twist they hadn't expected. Not the kneeling, not the viral clip, not the global reaction, but the confession, the humility, the rejection of political perfection. In a world where power often hides behind excuses, Traoré did something rare. He embraced accountability. He made leadership human again. And that left audiences, whether in Ouagadougou or Ohio, with one final haunting question. If authenticity is possible in Burkina Faso, why is it so rare in the nations that claim to lead the world? In the days that followed, commentators across continents tried to explain what had happened in that crowded studio in Ouagadougou. Some framed it through geopolitics, others through security. A few, especially in outlets like Africa News, tried to fold it back into familiar narratives about instability in Burkina Faso. But for millions who watched, Americans included, the truth was simpler. They had witnessed a rare kind of courage. Not the courage to command troops, not the courage to win arguments, but the courage to be human in front of the world. Ibrahim Traoré reminded people across Africa, across the diaspora, across oceans, that leadership does not have to be distant, polished, or untouchable. It can bend, it can listen, it can kneel, it can carry the names of the forgotten. And he ended the interview with a line that echoed far beyond Burkina Faso. I will not stop fighting for the people who trusted me with their hopes. So tonight, as you sit far from West Africa, ask yourself, what kind of leadership do we deserve? What kind of leadership do we demand? And why have we forgotten that power can still have a heart? Share if you believe Africa deserves leaders who stand with their people. Subscribe if you believe truth must rise above headlines.